Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Caleb Plitos. I wanted to talk to you guys today about something that just came out in the news of the C8 Corvette, and that has to do with the horsepower and torque numbers that are floating around. So back when the C8 was released, they came out with a list of numbers and stats for the C8 on what it could do, what kind of power it had, and things of that nature. Now, these have been tested just recently, and they came up with some very vastly different numbers. So that sparks a lot of different questions. Originally, people were thinking, why would an automaker say that their car can make less power than it actually can? So the specific test that I'm referencing is a test done by Motor Trend. Now, Motor Trend is a very popular automotive company, and they review and test all different kinds of cars across the board. And they were one of the first people to get their hands on a C8, and one of the first people to dyno it. And what a dyno is it's something that measures horsepower for the vehicle at the rear wheels, which we'll get into that a little bit more. So the whole premise of this story is that Motor Trend measured dyno numbers a lot higher than what General Motors claimed, and this had a lot of people wondering what was going on. To dive into the numbers a little bit, General Motors claimed that their C8 had 495 horsepower and 470 pound-feet of torque. But what Motor Trend saw at the wheels of the C8 is that it produced 478 horsepower and 536 pound-feet of torque, all the way up until 561 horsepower and 515 pound-feet of torque. So somewhere in that range. So what I mean by at the wheels is that horsepower on a dyno is measured by how much power is getting down to the ground. You lose power from the engine all the way to the rear wheels in things like the transmission and friction, and that all of that power doesn't necessarily make it onto the ground to push the car forward. So using those dyno numbers that Motor Trend came up with, that would leave the crank horsepower anywhere from 630 to 660 horsepower, which is vastly different than the 495 that General Motors claimed. So does the C8 really produce more power than General Motors says it does? Or is something else going on here? Motor Trend has produced a lot of great results and great testing over the years, but I'm going to talk to you about why the numbers on this test aren't really as good as they seem to be. So before I get into that, I just wanted to say thanks so much for clicking on this video. I really hope you subscribe and hit like on this. It really does a lot of good for me and the channel. So now into why the C8 produced these numbers and what was going on with the dyno in this situation. First off, Motor Trend assumed a 15% drivetrain loss for horsepower. So what that means is from the engine all the way to the wheels, they were assuming that you lose 15% of the power due to things like friction. So the horsepower in the engine is not necessarily going to be the horsepower on the ground. It should be about 15% less. And that's what they assumed. 15% drivetrain loss is not at all uncommon, but it is a number that we're assuming to calculate this data. Now, the largest problem with these test results is the fact in the dyno itself. The dyno was set to all-wheel drive. The C8 is a rear-wheel drive car. So this produced a lot of the error in these numbers. The dyno and the computer, in the sense that it was set to all-wheel drive, now thinks that the car has to overcome more inertia than it actually does. So that produces false numbers. This was most likely the largest factor to these false numbers in the test. This wasn't the only error in the dyno programming. The C8 was set with a lot of C7 specs, and a lot of C7 data was input into the dyno to calculate things like drag on the vehicle, and all of these statistics that we don't yet have for the C8 were assumed based on what the C7 has. So because of the fact that those either weren't released yet or they just haven't been tested yet, that comes into play too, in the fact that the C7 data was being used. So basically, this whole test was kind of just a fluke. It was a couple errors made, mistakes happen, it's no big deal. So that doesn't mean that the C8 isn't going to be incredibly fast or a great car that doesn't produce 495, but it just means that the numbers in this sense were a little bit overestimated because of error. Now that we understand this, we're better able to look at the car and actually believe the numbers that General Motors produced. I know it was kind of confusing in the news because of all these different numbers that were floating around and why Motor Trend got such a large amount of horsepower compared to what General Motors said. This car is so incredibly new and not a lot of testing has been done, so it's understandable that these results can happen sometimes. Looking forward to the future, I think it's a great thing that we're able to keep doing tests on the C8, and hopefully when all these other shops and Motor Trend will be able to get their hands on a C8 again, then we can get more data, which will then in turn give us more power for customization. To better understand the vehicle is a better way for us to be able to tune the vehicles and things of that nature. It's still an amazing car. I would still absolutely love to ride in one. It is definitely something I'd like to see in the future on this channel. Now, this isn't necessarily bad news for the C8. I think a lot of people were second guessing the numbers originally, and now that we're able to clear everything up, we can just better understand the C8 as a whole. I think that people, now that they're able to understand this more so, are better able to make a purchasing decision. So I don't think that this is going to negatively affect the C8. I don't think that it's bad news that the horsepower is actually originally what they claimed. I don't think that this will affect people's purchasing decisions. Let me know what you guys think about this. What do you think Motor Trend could or couldn't have done in order to make these better results? Thank you so much for checking out the channel. Please hit subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one.